Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you're listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Industrial Policy for the United States by Marc Fasteau and Ian Fletcher. This is a new book, actually very new. It just came out recently, much more new than I typically do. I try to aim for older books. If you're a regular listener, you know I don't always succeed. Sometimes a new book really catches my attention. And this is one of those books. I have to say, though, I actually, in full disclosure, received an early advance copy of this book. I had reviewed one of Ian Fletcher's previous books, Free Trade Doesn't Work, which was a fantastic book. And I want to have a look at this one as well. This one's not just by Fletcher. He teams up with somebody else here, Marc Fasteau, whom I had never heard of prior to this book. And let me say, this is a beast of a book. It is long. It is 668 pages long, which is definitely pretty substantial. And if I'm being honest, I think that I liked Fletcher's other book a little bit more. It was much shorter. I think that he really got straight to the point. This one, if I was the editor, I would probably have trimmed it down a little. It's 668 is a lot of pages. There are parts in here where it seems like the amount of detail provided is perhaps more than is necessary. They go into a great amount of detail about industrial policy and the various organizations, committees, departments, all the aspects of the federal government that are involved in industrial policy. It's remarkably detailed. And it reminds me of a book that I had when I was in college, which was a capstone marketing course. And in the beginning of the book was some really good principles of marketing. And then the rest of the book was case studies, where you could take what you've read and learned in the first portion of the book and apply it to the rest of the book. And this book follows the same sort of model. And it does come across a little bit like a textbook in that way. The first 4 chapters provide a great detail about industrial policy. And then from there, it's a lot of case studies, a lot of specific areas where the contents from the first portion of the book can be applied to what's being written about later in the book. But in some cases, they go into they refer back to the original principles. But for many of the areas of the book, the case studies and different descriptions of different departments and different industries, they don't always point back to what they've spoken about in the beginning. So what this would be like if I was a professor teaching a course on industrial policy. This would be my number one textbook. And the exercise would be to basically go through each of these chapters when they provide all this detail about all these various industrial policies and go back and with the class apply the principles at the beginning of the book to the various case studies. In some cases, they're really described as case studies. So the first after the first 4 chapters of theory, you get nation-by-nation case studies. So we look at China, we look at Korea, we look at Japan, Britain, France, Germany, various industrial policy ideas that these countries have tried to implement. And some of them have been more successful, and some of them have been less successful. So that's really interesting to see what worked and what didn't work. If you are involved in planning industrial policy for the federal government or at the state level, this is really a book that has to be on your shelf. I don't think there is a book in existence that provides this level of detail about industrial policy. It should be a textbook in every classroom where industrial policy is discussed. It should be on the bookshelf of every person involved in the government or involved in even in industry in general, where you have some role to play or some input to provide into industrial policy. You should have this book, and you should refer back to it frequently, and you should go through it meticulously and look at the various case studies and think them through about what they've done correctly and what they've done incorrectly. There's a pretty extended history of U.S. industrial policy. I mean, the book is called Industrial Policy for the United States. So after all of the various case studies in other countries, which takes up a good portion of the book, probably the first quarter of the book, well, really probably once you factor in the initial 4 chapters of theory plus the nation-by-nation case studies, you're about a third of the way in. Then there's a extended section where they talk about U.S. industrial policy historically. And then from there, they start to move into the various initiatives where the government is involved to greater or lesser degrees in industrial policy, whether it's supporting innovation or providing legal frameworks for innovation, research, and development. There's a chapter on patents. I was really interested in the patent chapter. I thought that was probably one of the most interesting chapters. Some chapters I feel like it's like, as I said, the detail can sometimes feel excessive. It begins to lose the narrative and just becomes an encyclopedic catalog of every single initiative in overwhelming detail. Sometimes it seems like a bit of a slog. And I guess if I was the editor, I would have trimmed out some of the details. But I'm not the editor, and of course, depending on what your role is, if you're involved in decision making at the government level, it may be the case that you really want that level of detail. You don't want this stuff left out because you want to be able to have stuff to refer to. He talks later in the book about regional cluster case studies, a few more case studies here, where he talks about Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Life Sciences Cluster, and the upstate New York Semiconductor Cluster. So these are like regional areas where industries have thrived and had a sort of industrial ecosystem. Oftentimes these are based around a university. It seems as though this sort of regional industrial cluster depends upon having a university at its core. And then he closes out the book with some recommendations, which are, I think, all very good recommendations for an industrial policy for the United States. Tariffs are in here as a component of the industrial policy, but it's a lot more robust than just tariffs. I tend to be a big fan of tariffs, and I tend to be a little bit more skeptical when the industrial policy moves into other areas. But a compelling case is made here that in some cases, tariffs aren't always enough. Other countries provide subsidies for research and development for their industries, and those foreign companies working hand in hand with foreign governments are able to get a jump start on technology and are able to jump ahead of U.S. technology because they're not as concerned about the profitability, the immediate profitability of some particular research project. It seems really effective, these foreign subsidies, and in some cases we just can't compete, and the tariffs aren't necessarily enough. Maybe it's the case that we also need to provide some subsidies to some industries in our own country. That's can be kind of a controversial concept of subsidizing industry, but in the global competitive environment, if the foreign nations are subsidizing research and development for their corporations and we're not, it can't help but seem as though it's going to put us at a disadvantage. It's tricky because our nation is so far in debt, it's hard to justify spending money for the advantage of corporations, but sometimes I think maybe that's among the better things that our government could be spending money on. It's certainly the case that we spend money on other things that are probably even less beneficial than advanced technology research and development. So like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple of sections here. I don't want to read a tremendous amount because it is a new book, and I tend to not want to read an awful lot straight from the new book. You really need to go out and get a copy of this yourself if you really want to see the details. I've got a few parts I'll talk about, and then there's some major stuff in here that I'm not really going to get too into, because I think you need to get it yourself and dig in. Like there's a Industrial Policy Toolkit, Chapter 3, the Industrial Policy Toolkit. That's a great chapter. It breaks down, so tariffs, as I said, tariffs are one part of it, but there are many other parts of industrial policy above and beyond tariffs that can be deployed, and those are all broken down in detail in Chapter 3, the Industrial Policy Toolkit. I'm not going to go over the toolkit, but suffice to say, it's good stuff. What I do want to read is when he talks about advantageous economic activities, advantageous industries, and I think that's a concept that is very important for discussions of industrial policy and for discussions of economics, to not just assume that a dollar in one industry is the same as a dollar in another industry. I know I've mentioned before, but I keep coming back to it because it's kind of a remarkably naive statement. But there was a policy advisor of some sort. I don't remember what his role was, but I had a public figure, an economist, who had stated notoriously that it doesn't matter whether we make potato chips or computer chips. $1 million, if we produce $1 million of potato chips or we produce $1 million of computer chips, $1 million is $1 million, and it doesn't really matter. But of course, there's no superpower in the world that produces potato chips. You can't be a global power and be an agricultural nation. You have to be an industrial nation. You have to have technological capacities. You have to be able to build things. If you can't do that, you can't be a long-term global power. So there are other concerns beyond just the dollar value of things. And that's because some industries are advantageous and other industries are not advantageous. Potato chips, obviously, are not an advantageous industry, and computer chips are. So he talks a little bit about what it takes for an industry or for an economic activity to be advantageous. And that's what I want to discuss here. So the authors here say, quote, "Increasing returns means that when a firm spends more money on inputs, the value of its outputs goes up even faster. For example, if baking a loaf of bread requires a $1,000 oven and $1 worth of dough, then baking one loaf will cost $1,001 per loaf. But if it bakes 2 loaves, the cost will be $501 per loaf. And if one bakes enough loaves, it will eventually get close to $1 per loaf. Because the cost per loaf continually falls, the value of additional bread obtained for each additional dollar continually rises. In industries where increasing returns are present, the market will not be completely free. This is clearest in the extreme case, increasing returns that go on forever, costs dropping ad infinitum with each additional unit produced. A search engine like Google is probably the closest thing to this in the real world. The most efficient outcome is one producer for the entire world, because 2 producers would each produce half as much, and therefore have higher costs. An initially free market will tend to deliver this one producer outcome, because whichever producer has slightly higher volume will have slightly lower costs per unit, be more competitive, gain volume at the expense of its rivals, lower its costs more, and inexorably drive its rivals out of business. But then the free market will come to end, because there will be a monopoly. Any new firm entering the industry, unless it can do so with the same production volume as the incumbent, will not be competitive. Most increasing returns are not this extreme, but the more increasing returns are present in an industry, the less free the market will be. There will be imperfect competition, not one single producer, but only a few. so that each firm will be big enough for its actions to affect the entire market. In other words, an oligopoly. Increasing returns tend to make the industries in which they occur oligopolistic, a fact with great significance for industrial policy, as we will see below. Increasing returns are the first of a set of characteristics of what this book will refer to as advantageous economic activities. These characteristics tend to coincide, reinforce each other, and build up cumulative causation when something happens because multiple causes build up over time. To wit, 1. Increasing returns. 2. Pricing power. 3. Technological dynamism. 4. Dynamic rent seeking. And 5. Synergies. Economic activities with the above characteristics tend to produce dynamic efficiency, causing an economy to repeatedly gain in productivity and thus grow. The more a nation's economy consists of such activities, the more prosperous it will be today, and the better its growth prospects will be for tomorrow. Industrial policy, at root, is about increasing the quantity of such activities in an economy. Pricing power occurs whenever a firm can choose to charge more and sell less, or charge less and sell more, as opposed to just having to accept the market price. The latter happens when there are many small competitors. Each will be able to sell at will at the market price, but not at all if it charges any more. Pricing power requires there be some factor present that reduces competition, so pricing power tends to accompany increasing returns. Pricing power means the sellers get a higher price. It can come from being the only coffee shop on the block, but the kind relevant to industrial policy is the result of producing things that are hard to produce, such as jet engines or smartphones. When only a small number of highly skilled firms can produce a given product, an oligopoly will develop, whose members will then have pricing power. In fact, whenever know-how is the major production cost in an industry, there will necessarily be increasing returns, because once that know-how has been paid for, each additional unit of product amortizes its cost over more output. Technological dynamism. Hard to produce usually means needing sophisticated technology. But what was once cutting edge usually becomes commonplace and easy to produce over time. So what producers want is ongoing technological change, so that they can stay forever near the leading edge, employing the difficult, relatively new technology that confers pricing power. One way to accomplish this is to produce the technological change oneself. Enter R&D. Pursuing profits in this way is called dynamic rent seeking. The term rent, in the peculiar usage of economics, means profits exceeding what a free market would grant. Dynamic rent seeking is based on continually innovating and upgrading to hold on to the rent. Its opposite is static rent seeking, which means seeking some privilege, such as a legal monopoly, that enables charging a premium without doing anything productive to earn it. Static rent seeking does an economy no good, but dynamic rent seeking increases productivity and thus produces growth. Synergies. Some economic activities, when they first emerge or later improve their productivity, enable other activities to emerge or improve their productivity. For example, cheap, mass-produced steel, whose first major market was railroad rails, made skyscrapers possible. Vacuum tube production originally flowered to build radios, then enabled production of televisions. Computer chips were invented when computers were room-sized, but eventually became sufficiently small, powerful, and cheap to enable smartphones. Smartphones, in turn, enabled ride-hailing services. Jet engines developed for military aircraft enabled passenger jets, mass tourism, and ultimately Disney World. When synergies are present, advances in one part of the economy tend to push forward other parts. This is important for long-term growth, because there is a limit to how much any one industry can grow, simply because there is a limit to how much of any one product consumers want. When are synergies absent? Consider single export economies, producing, say, bananas or petroleum. A nation may be poor if it produces only bananas, or rich if it produces only petroleum, but either way, market forces alone are unlikely to set it on a path to producing anything else. End quote. Okay, so what you have here is is advantageous economic activities, which ultimately are the domain of advantageous industries. And advantageous industries are what you want your nation to have. You want your nation to have these 5 industries that have these 5 features: increasing returns, pricing power, technological dynamism, dynamic rent seeking, and synergies. Let's start with the last one, synergies, which is that an industry can spawn other industries. And he talks about bananas and petroleum. If your nation produces bananas, there's nothing in the banana production process. There's nothing in the creation of bananas. There's nothing in the research and development of banana growing that's really going to benefit you in developing additional corollary industries. Now, that's not to say that there's absolutely zero synergy with anything else. Maybe some additional food production, making banana bread, and maybe your country is able to not only export bananas but also export banana bread. Right? It's not that there's zero synergy, but obviously some things like computer chips enable a whole host of parallel additional things. Automobile production facilitates the creation of all the various suppliers of automobiles, and gives your workers the technological expertise to work in machine shops and to work on production lines and assembly lines and engineering and combustion and all the other technologies that go into an automobile that can also be used in adjacent technologies, things of that sort. Those are synergies. Dynamic rent seeking is essentially when one company can maintain a higher level of profit than a free market would provide. So if you are somehow able to acquire a state-sponsored monopoly and you're able to charge more than a free market would allow you to charge because no one's allowed to compete with you, that's a static rent seeking. You've got this position and you don't have to work for it, and you have it and you can make extra money from it. Dynamic rent seeking is when, say, you have developed a new technology and nobody else has that technology, and you can charge more for it than you would be able to charge if you had a bunch of competitors. But you don't have a bunch of competitors because you're cutting edge. You're the only one who's got this technology. Maybe you've got a patent. You've got some corner in the market where a free market, if you had a bunch of competitors, you would not be able to charge as much as you can because you don't have competitors because of your technological advantage. That's dynamic rent seeking. Technological dynamism is similar to that, and that's just to say that you want an industry that's going to allow you to continue to develop. If you're in if you have a software industry, like the software industry is continually changing, and you want to have industries where you can, today's technology that's cutting edge today is not so cutting edge tomorrow, and you want industries that are able to stay at the cutting edge, so you want to be involved in industries where there's ongoing change, there's ongoing research and development, new things are being developed, new products are being created. It's technologically dynamic. It's changing, and that technological dynamism allows you to acquire that dynamic rent seeking. Those two are certainly related. The other one here, pricing power, which is the idea that you can control how much you charge. If you sell, like the classic example, if you sell grain, and one piece of grain, let's say wheat, you sell wheat, and whatever it is, a grain of wheat, a pound of wheat, a ton of wheat, wheat is wheat, and the going market of wheat prices is whatever. And you can't just say, I'm going to charge more for my wheat, unless you have like a real reason to do so. Your wheat is in some way demonstrably better, right? It's different. And in that case, you've differentiated it through some technological means of whatever. But if you're just talking flat wheat in a pure free market, there's no differentiation and everybody's charging the same price for wheat. Like gold, the price of gold. You can't charge more for gold than the ongoing market rate for gold. You can't charge more for petroleum than the market. There's some certain amount of dollars per barrel of petroleum. And that's the price. That's what everybody has to charge because it's not differentiated. You have no pricing power. You charge what the market rate is, and that's that. If you have pricing power, then you can set the price. You can charge more for it because, for some one reason or another, you have pricing power. And he says, like a monopoly is an example. If you're the only coffee shop on the block, you have no competitors, you can charge a little bit more for a cup of coffee than you could if people could very easily choose a different coffee shop, right? You have some sort of monopoly on this, or you have some mechanism, whatever it may be, some mechanism of controlling how much you charge for the product. Then you have pricing power. And then, of course, going back to the first, which was increasing returns, and he gives a pretty straightforward example of an oven, and you're making loaves of bread, and your oven costs $1,000, and your loaves of bread, you have to pay $1 for the dough to make the bread for one loaf. Right? One loaf of bread has cost you $1,001. It's cost you the price of the oven plus the price of the dough. And then the more loaves of bread you bake, the more the cost of the oven is divided amongst the loaves of bread. If you make 2 loaves of bread, each loaf of bread cost you $501 because it was $1 for the dough and then $500 for half of the oven, and the other loaf of bread paid for the other half of the oven, essentially, right? If you make 1,000,000 loaves of bread, then that cost of that $1,000 oven is divided up amongst all the loaves of bread that you've baked in it. It didn't, right? No one loaf of bread carried the cost of the oven. The cost of the oven is split up, so the cost per loaf of bread approaches $1. The more bread you make, the more it approaches $1. This is like an economy of scale. This is increasing returns. Because your profit per loaf of bread, right? Like say you charge $2 for a loaf of bread. Well, you can't be profitable unless you make enough bread. You make 1,000 slices, 1,000 loaves of bread. Each loaf of bread has $1 in dough and $1 worth of the cost of the oven because there are 1,000 loaves of bread and it cost you $1,000. At this point, your costs are $2 and you're selling it for $2 a loaf. At that point, you're breaking even. If you make 2,000 loaves of bread, now you're making more profit because each loaf of bread only has 50 cents worth of the cost of the oven, right? So now you've got 50 cents of profit. And that's increasing returns. The more of them you produce, the greater your profit per unit. And those are the 5 qualities of industries that makes them advantageous. Any industry that checks these 5 boxes is an advantageous industry. It's an industry you want your country to have. And something like bananas is not an advantageous industry. It doesn't really necessarily hit these. It might hit some of them to some extent, but it doesn't really hit these, right? A banana is a banana is a banana. You don't have pricing power. You just have to charge the going rate for bananas. So there are certain industries that are advantageous and other industries that are not advantageous. And that's kind of the whole point of this book, is that the free market alone is not going to give your nation advantageous industries. It's going to give some nation advantageous industries, but it might not be yours. It might be some other nation gets the advantageous industries. And you can't just allow the free market to just determine which nation gets the advantageous industries, because it's in your interest as a nation and as leaders of the nation to do what you have to do to make sure that your nation has the advantageous industries and the other nation grows the bananas, right? You have a duty to your nation to shape its industrial base to be the sort of thing that provides your nation with advantage. So he talks a little bit about picking winners and losers. And this is at the end of the toolkit. I'm not going to, as I said, I'm not going to go through the toolkit. You should grab this book and have a look at the toolkit. These are the tools that a government can use to ensure that its nation has the advantageous industries. And so that's the toolkit that you want to deploy. But here they say, quote, "The net result of applying the above policies is that many governments have favored particular firms at particular times, so that government, not the marketplace, picked which grew and made a profit. Pace abstract arguments that it is impossible to outperform the market by doing this. Some governments have succeeded at this some of the time. Many governments have also failed, as the outcomes depend on the quality of the policies imposed. Above all, failure has been the rule in nations that have lacked any systemic understanding of what industrial policy should aim at and how it can work. Opponents of industrial policy point to its documented failures, which are certainly real, as evidence that the very concept is doomed. But in the private sector, the failure of some firms is not taken as proof that capitalism is unworkable. Similarly, arguments against full-blown central planning, in which government controls all economic decisions, are misapplied against rational industrial policy, which take a market framework as given and intervenes only strategically. Another understandable objection to industrial policy is political capture, i.e. the corruption of decision-making by industry for its own interests. But industrial policy is no different from any other area of government in this regard. Those on the receiving end of policy will always try to bend it to their own benefit, and much of our political system revolves around countering such efforts. For example, because the danger of rent-seeking is well known and resented, such attempts will generate political pushback. Good industrial policy programs have built-in processes to mitigate corruption, such as transparency rules, conflict of interest laws, and requirements that officials making scientific decisions have corresponding scientific credentials. Metrics, such as numbers of jobs created and sales figures for startups nurtured, enable the monitoring and culling of ineffective policies. Clawback provisions can recover grants from firms when goals for which subsidies are provided are not met. In a developed nation like the U.S., picking winners will only rarely be appropriate, as the sophistication of our private sector, unlike in developing nations, makes it quite capable of picking most winners on its own. Most industrial policies America will need will not involve favoring the profitability of any one enterprise. Picking technologies and favoring advantageous sectors is not picking winners, because these policies do not direct profit to any particular company, nor is it picking winners to level the playing field with tariffs. There is a market layer between these governmental decisions and private sector bottom lines. However, it will sometimes be necessary for government to pick winners, to create or sustain national champions in key industries by providing large-scale support to particular firms. It would not be rational for America to neglect Boeing or Intel, its de facto national champions in large commercial aircraft and semiconductors. And it was appropriate for the CHIPS Act of 2022 to subsidize creation of onshore capacity to manufacture the most advanced computer chips. The appropriate quid pro quo for such support is that the recipient firms continually develop and manufacture advantageous, risky, difficult technologies with long time horizons in the U.S. Similarly, where the risk is too high, the rewards too uncertain, and the time to market too long for private capital, it will be necessary for government to pick winners, to help small companies developing breakthrough technologies get through the valley of death to initialize commercialization. In such cases, a public version of the portfolio strategy of private sector VCs will be appropriate, supporting firms taking different approaches to commercialization, with the understanding that most will fail, but the successes will be valuable enough to outweigh them. The alternative is to allow these technologies to languish in the lab and watch other nations commercialize them. End quote. So there you just have kind of the concept of picking winners, and as capitalists, we tend to think, you don't want the government picking winners and losers. You don't want the government deciding which firms are going to be successful and which firms are not. You want the market to decide which firms are going to be successful and which ones aren't. And you even, depending on your devotion to free trade, your devotion to free markets, you want the market to determine which industries are going to work and which industries won't. If you're an advocate of comparative advantage, then you want the market to determine which industries your nation has a comparative advantage in, and that will be the industry that your nation should adopt, because that's where your efficiency and your competence lies. And the government can only interfere with the efficiency of the market, right? That's the free market approach. But as we determined, not all industries are equal, and some of them are advantageous. And if the government pressures the market, if the government applies incentives and disincentives to the market to favor some industries over others, that may be interpreted as a form of picking winners and losers, even though it might not be specifying firms. If you're in the disfavored industry, you're certainly interpreting this as the government has picked you as a loser. So there's always going to be some amount, I think, of pushback against industrial policy along the terms of picking winners and losers. But he says, look, Boeing and Intel, Boeing is our national champion. In other words, it is our primary corporation in aircraft construction. And Intel is our primary company in semiconductors. And we can't just neglect the health of these major corporations. And this is something that's sometimes hard to swallow, like the auto bailouts. On the one hand, you want to say, well, you guys, you companies in Detroit, you car manufacturers, you failed to compete effectively. You don't make good cars. And you made a bunch of bad business decisions. And now your companies are going bankrupt. And now the government has to bail you out. But when you were profitable, you privatized the profits, right, and socialized the losses. And this sort of the bailouts of Wall Street and stuff, like, well, can we allow our automotive industry to fail? Should we be allowing our automotive industry to fail? I would say no, and the same thing with our financial sector. Should we allow our financial sector to fail, and other nations and other exchange markets to kind of replace Wall Street? Now, only stepping in when they are, in dire straits and bailing them out with taxpayer money is not really prudent industrial policy. But I think in some case, particularly in the case of the auto industry, the government got a lot of that money back. So it didn't really cost us a tremendous amount of money. And there is a sense in which I do want the government to pick winners and losers, because I want the government to pick American firms as winners and foreign firms as losers, right? I want the government to favor our auto industry over the Japanese auto industry. And if it comes down to it, if the government has to act or even spend money to make sure that our auto industry is healthy and has market share, or is employing people, or what have you, then sometimes, okay, I do want the government to pick winners and losers in that regard. And also with, developing startups, if the government needs to, he talks about the valley of death, and this is the idea where sometimes you can design something out in a lab, maybe on a university or some research and development institution, and create a prototype, and then you might be a company that creates something. You produce televisions or whatever, and you've been producing televisions for a long time. It's commercialized, and you have all the infrastructure to build them. You have the factories, you have the know-how, right? Those are two sides of the valley of death. And getting something from the lab, getting something from the prototype and the conceptual stages over into the realm of profitable production is challenging. You have to move from nobody knowing what your product is or using your product to your product being widely adopted, and have companies be willing to take a chance on your new product, and have these companies be willing to invest in the infrastructure necessary to build your new product. This is the valley of death, getting it from the lab to the store. And so the government at times can help build bridges across the valley of death. That's one part of industrial policy. And there's a sort of picking winners and losers that takes place there, where the government is saying, these particular startups who have developed their products to a point where they are ready for our assistance. They're going to get a little bit of help. So, there's a little bit of picking winners and losers that is inevitable, but you should try, if you're designing industrial policy, you should aim at minimizing favor for any particular firm, but it's okay to favor industries. It's okay to favor industries if you want your nation to be successful. And then they do begin to discuss international trade in a little more detail. I just want to read a brief section here where they say, quote, "Bringing trade into the industrial policy picture ends the possibility of purely free market policy, because so few of America's trade counterparties play by free market rules. Opening our economy to them means opening it to the distorting effects of their policies on our markets. If China sells subsidized widgets in the U.S., their price here will not be a free market price. As a result, whether widgets are produced in the U.S. and at what profit and with what wages will no longer be determined by the market, but by the size of China's subsidy. Americans will not be able to rely upon the market efficiently allocating the location of production between the two nations, or allocating the amount of labor and capital to each industry that is optimal, either for the U.S. or for the world at large. Under these conditions, any attempt by the U.S. to embrace a free market policy will just result in the size and product mix of its tradable sectors being determined by the industrial policies of other nations. The U.S. today is in the position small nations have always been in, and that it itself was in through the early 19th century, needing to design its economic policies around those of other nations. It follows that some degree of mercantilism, i.e., state intervention in trade to defend our national economic interests, is now forced upon us. Whether to intervene is no longer a choice. The unavoidable question is what kind of intervention is best. The overarching theme of this book is that while free markets are a vital part of a successful economy, it is also necessary, A, to take advantage of and respond proactively to their inherent shortcomings, and B, to counter the efforts of other nations to intervene in markets to one's disadvantage. As explained below, mainstream trade theory is a perfect markets theory and falls apart when one examines the shortcomings of international markets and how they can be deliberately exploited. Trade enables every nation to plug into a global economy that has greater technological sophistication and production scale than it has. This is true for all nations, but especially for small ones, as they lack the ability to produce most goods domestically, either efficiently or at all. Their internal markets are too small to support production facilities at viable scale, and domestic sales alone will not provide enough profits to plow back into R&D to keep these industries up to date. But by exporting, even small nations can achieve production scale sufficient to be cost competitive in scale economy, i.e. advantageous industries, with all the benefits of such industries discussed in Chapter 2. Trade enables nations to specialize in narrow but lucrative niches. Taiwan, for example, in 2012 made 89% of the world's laptops, with a domestic market roughly 1% of the world's total. These niches can be not only end products, but also components, or steps in global supply chains. Imports play a key role too. Few nations can successfully produce all the goods their citizens want. Import competition disciplines domestic producers against inefficiency, presses them to improve, and disrupts crony capitalists. Nations can import quality of demand and quality of supply by serving demanding foreign customers and buying from the best foreign suppliers. Imports can provide needed components and raw materials for the nation's exports. Trade confronts every nation seeking to acquire more advantageous industries, with the fact that the nations already having them will often have entrenched positions that are hard to overcome by market means alone. Incumbents producing at high volumes will have lower per unit cost than newcomers. supply chains with interlocking dependencies, and established business relationships can be hard to shift. Specialized expertise, especially learning by doing, which requires actual production, can be difficult to acquire. As a result, new entrants must use proactive industrial policies to break in. End quote. So here he begins to discuss international trade in a little more detail, and basically it's difficult to enter for a nation of any size, particularly small nations, to enter global trade against other countries that have advantageous industries and economies of scale and are selling in the global market. And these small companies have no choice but to have some sort of industrial policy. And he says that the United States really is in the same position, a similar position to the position it was in the early 19th century of needing to protect its industries from foreign trade. And it really comes down to what he talks about in the very beginning, which is that in international trade, there is no such thing as a free market. Because even if your government doesn't impose or employ any industrial policy at all, as long as you're importing goods from a country that does, then your market is being distorted by the industrial policy of other nations. If China subsidizes its widgets so that the cost per widget is lower to the producer than it would be if the government wasn't providing any subsidies, then as a result, China can sell those widgets because they don't need to recoup as much cost. They can sell it at a lower price. And selling it at a lower price in American markets distorts the market. It's not a free market because the industrial policy of China is distorting the market, causing more of those Chinese widgets to be sold and American widgets to not be competitive, unless our government were to subsidize our widgets to the same degree that the Chinese government subsidizes their widgets. So there is no free market as long as you're participating in international trade. And this means that we're basically forced into industrial policy. We don't really have a choice. We just have to determine what the best policy is and deploy it. So from here, I want to jump to one point when he goes through the history. This chapter is 13, the Renaissance Origins of Industrial Policy, and talks about mercantilism and early industrial policy. And he talks a little bit here about Spain and England, and I thought this was a nice, clear example. They say, quote, Spain used tariffs not to support its manufacturing, but to protect its agriculture, such as sheep raising, olive oil, and wine. Its tax policies favored agricultural estates, not industry. Gold and silver from the Americas caused inflation, which helped make Spanish manufacturing, such as its once internationally respected textile industry, uncompetitive. Spanish economists, though not so called at the time, diagnosed Madrid's policy errors quite accurately, but the vested interests of the day, such as the powerful Council of the Mesta, a sheep raisers' organization to which the crown owed money, prevailed. Now consider England. Toward the end of the 15th century, it was a poor farming nation, heavily indebted to the Italian bankers who financed its government. Its main export was raw wool. But then its government deliberately set out to upgrade its economy by doing what would today be called moving up the value chain. It proactively pushed its economy out of low value, what we have called in this book disadvantageous agricultural activities such as raising sheep, and into higher value, advantageous industrial activities, above all, weaving woolen cloth. Henry VII, who came to power in 1485, had spent time as a youth in Burgundy, in present-day France, where English wool was woven into cloth. The wealth there contrasted with the poverty he later found in England. But, he observed, the wealth in Burgundy depended upon imported English raw materials, wool and the fuller's earth used to clean it. So, when he came to power, he imposed the classic anti-Ricardian policy, centuries before Ricardo, of not passively accepting a nation's comparative advantage, but proactively shaping it. English strategy was gradual. It started with import substitution. In 1489, tariffs on cloth were increased, in a classic case of infant industry protection. Cloth manufacturing was encouraged. The crown paid for skilled foreign workers to be brought in, and businesses were paid bounties, in modern term subsidies, for establishing textile manufacturing firms. When sufficient manufacturing capacity had developed to process all domestic wool production, England prohibited wool's export, which reduced the cost to English producers and increased it for foreign ones. These developments created what has been called the closest approximation to a businessman's government among the ancien regimes of Europe. The great 19th century German economist Friedrich List, who helped set Germany on its own successful path of protectionist industrialization, put it this way: the principal sell manufacturers buy raw material was, during centuries, the English substitute for an economic theory. England's picking winner's choice of woolen textiles was based on a correct understanding of the technological and economic circumstances of the day. At the time, out of all existing economic activities, this was the only large one within English reach that was experiencing rapid technological innovation and productivity growth. It could, therefore, absorb productive capital, as opposed to mere castle and cathedral building and the like, because here, large-scale investments could pay back a return. In this industry, there were major economies of scale to be reaped. It offered opportunities to accumulate technological knowledge that conferred pricing power because not every nation had it. And it taught and financed development of the all-important organizational capabilities that would equip England for success in subsequent industries. End quote. So what we see here is a comparison of Spain and England, and this is nice and concise. Spain had tariffs on agriculture, and it had inflation from gold and silver from the Americas, but that's almost a whole other question. But the thing is that the economists of the day understood what was going on, but vested interests. The sheep raisers organization called Council of the Mesta, and the crown owed them money, and their will prevailed, which was that they wanted their agriculture to be protected from foreign competition. So Spain didn't protect its manufacturing, it protected its agriculture, and that did not work well for Spain. Spain just kind of, its manufacturing just languished, didn't advance, and wasn't supported, and Spain never really became a technological powerhouse. England, on the other hand, was backwater, and it produced wool, and that was all it produced, really. That was its major export. But the king, Henry VII, had spent time in France and had seen mills where English wool was woven into cloth. And there was wealth there, and among the wool producers in England, there was poverty. So Henry said, you know what, these guys in Burgundy are dependent upon English wool. They can't operate without it, and yet they have all the money and we don't have any. So he decided to not accept the comparative advantage, which led England to produce wool, but decided he wanted to shape and control what England was producing, to move it into a higher technological realm, to make it an industrial powerhouse. And he did that with a few simple steps. Tariffs on cloth, to encourage English people to produce their own cloth. They had all the materials necessary, and the more the foreign cloth cost to the English consumer, the more feasible it became for English mills to produce their own cloth. And as time, they paid for foreign workers, and they subsidized the establishment of textile firms. And then at some point, when there was manufacturing capacity, England began to prohibit the export of wool, which had the impact of lowering wool prices, because now there's all this wool in England and they can't sell it overseas anymore, which means they have sort of a surplus, and that's going to drive the price down. So the wool gets cheaper, and it becomes more profitable for them to create cloth. And these simple industrial policies, nothing incredibly complex, really jump-started England's rise as an industrial powerhouse. When the king said, I don't want to produce just wool, I want to produce cloth. I want to develop technology. And we see a few of the other points here. One of them, several of them, let's see. There were economies of scale to be reaped. This was within reach. I think this is important. Out of all the existing economic activities, this was the only large one within English reach that was experiencing rapid technological innovation and productivity growth. We have technological dynamism, as we spoke of before, which carries with it dynamic rent-seeking. We have something that is achievable. They didn't just decide that they were going to produce something that they had never involved themselves with. They didn't just throw a dart at a dartboard and said, there's the industry we want. They said, we have a lot of wool. It would make sense for us to use this wool to make cloth. Let's start there. Let's start with this particular industry that is within reach. And so they set themselves an industrial policy that was achievable. And they did pick winners and losers. If you were a wool producer in England, when the king said you can no longer export your wool, and you have been exporting tons of wool to France and making good money selling that wool to France, and now you can't export it anymore, and that drives the price of wool down, as a wool producer, you're not happy with this. You've been selected as a loser. But the people who had the textile mills saw the price of their input materials drop, and they made more profit, and they were selected as the winners. And it's unfortunate for the losers involved, but the fact is, England needed to increase its technological capacity, and you can't do that by being a shepherd. So while I'm sure they loved their shepherds, it wasn't feasible for them to stick with that policy over the long term. They had to shift resources towards technology. And the other thing mentioned here is that it taught and financed development of the all-important organizational capabilities that would equip England for success in subsequent industries. So this is a sort of thing where there's skill being gained, there's facilities being built that can move into adjacent industries. And I mean, I'm not certain what industries are really adjacent to cloth production, but I'm certain they exist. The organizational capacity, management skill, the creation of assembly lines, and various technological skills in the industrial sector as opposed to farming skills that could then be applied to other industries. So there's a sort of synergy happening here. You can see from the previous examples why this was an advantageous industry for England to enter into. So now there's one last section that I want to read much further on in the book when they're talking about more detail about present day and recent past industrial policy in the U.S. And this part here actually made me a little bit angry because it just showed how stupid the U.S. Industrial policy can be and how just not patriotic, not loyal to the country, a lot of these multinational corporations are. And this is in regard to semiconductors. So here they say, quote, Japan deployed a full range of industrial policies to support its semiconductor industry, including subsidies for research, low or no interest loans, dumping, currency manipulation, and non-binding but closely followed administrative guidance from its Ministry of International Trade and Industry. It kept foreign products out of its home market, financed trading companies with global reach, and orchestrated fierce domestic competition to strengthen their companies. U.S. firms faced huge losses, and their capacity utilization and deployment crashed. Only two civilian producers remained, Texas Instruments and Micron. Profit margins in DRAMs are slim, favoring agile companies with deep pockets. U.S.-based companies had a higher cost of capital than their Japanese rivals, who benefited from a financial system deliberately structured to favor long-term investment and who could obtain loans from banks associated with their keiretsu corporate groups. The U.S. responded when its semiconductor industry was on the brink of collapse. In responding to a lobbying blitz by the Industry Association and its members, the Reagan administration in 1986 negotiated the U.S.-Japan Semiconductor Agreement. Tokyo agreed to end dumping, selling below production cost, of DRAMs and other semiconductors, and help foreign producers achieve a 20% share of the Japanese market within 5 years. This agreement did not revive U.S. production. The Japanese had invested more in plant and equipment and had developed superior design and manufacturing processes, surpassing U.S. firms in time to market and achieving lower failure rates in manufacturing. They appeared to have superior management and a quality philosophy their U.S. competitors could not match. As a result, about half of the U.S. companies abandoned the market. When Japan failed to prevent its companies from dumping DRAMs into third country markets in 1987, violating the terms of the deal, the U.S. imposed a 100% tariff on $300 million of Japanese electronic goods, many containing DRAMs. In this dire context, the Defense Science Board released its Semiconductor Dependency Report. It noted the loss of U.S. commercial market share, but even more important, it argued, was the loss of technological leadership, especially in manufacturing. It said that although DoD dependence on foreign-made semiconductors was still modest, it would get worse if action was not taken. The report proposed a consortium of semiconductor companies to upgrade U.S. research, development, and manufacturing. In an unprecedented move, the DSB recommended funding of $200 million per year for 5 years. The resulting organization, established that same year, was Sematech, short for Semiconductor Manufacturing Technology. It was funded through DARPA at $100 million per year for its first 5 years, plus an equal amount contributed by 14 U.S. companies. Membership was limited to U.S.-owned firms, and American subsidiaries of foreign companies were excluded. Sematech transferred cutting-edge manufacturing technology to 142 affiliated U.S. semiconductor equipment makers and coordinated R&D among its corporate sponsors. Sematech's purposes were intentionally mainly civilian, with an explicitly indirect relationship to national security. It would bolster U.S. military strength by supporting the overall industry. Congress intended that Sematech be led by industry, so DARPA was not given full oversight, due to concerns that DARPA might steer Sematech toward defense-specific applications. Instead, its involvement was limited to attending meetings of Sematech's board of directors, its technical advisory boards, and its special training sessions. To preserve competition and avoid giving its members reason to withhold technological advances, Sematech's remit was to develop only generic, pre-competitive technologies, i.e. nothing product-specific or less than 18 months away from the market. Per its advisory council, its goal was high-yield, factory-scale application of 0.3-micron production technology in Sematech's own fabricating facility, or fab, by 1993, and estimated 6 to 12 months ahead of leading foreign chipmakers and 3 years ahead of most U.S. merchant firms without Sematech. The resulting commercial advantage for Sematech's members could be substantial. This acknowledgement, that in the absence of Sematech, most U.S. companies would have been 3 years behind the state-of-the-art by 1993, was stunning, because a 3-year advantage in this fast-moving industry would be almost impossible to overcome. The U.S. government's total financial contribution to Sematech between 1988 and 1996 was approximately $2 billion in 2023 dollars. It did help the industry rebound. In 1993, it announced that it had achieved one of its primary technical goals, 0.3-micron manufacturing capability using only U.S.-made equipment. Another indicator of Sematech's effectiveness is that its corporate members continued to fund it after the government's contributions ended. They had learned that a consortium could address technical challenges too complex and costly for any single firm. The General Accounting Office reported to Congress that Sematech worked because it was led by private sector members. To be sure, other policies contributed to the revival of the U.S. semiconductor industry. The 1985 Plaza Accord, the Semiconductor Agreement of 1986, and the tariff on Japanese electronics in 1987 all did their part. Together with Sematech, these policies constituted a rare instance of broadly coordinated U.S. industrial policy. 2 years after its last government grant, in 1996, Sematech opened its doors to foreign firms, including Hyundai from South Korea, Philips from the Netherlands, SGS Thomson from France and Italy, Siemens from Germany, and TSMC from Taiwan. The American industry now saw itself as part of a global industry, engaging in alliances with foreign firms and building plants abroad. When asked about admitting foreign companies, Sematech's CEO responded, "We are a global industry. Not one of our members doesn't have facilities around the world. Why wouldn't you have a global consortium?" End quote. So here we see the semiconductor industry. And he starts off with a description of Japan's industrial policies. And these policies include subsidies for research, low interest or no interest loans, product dumping, in other words, selling it below cost to gain foreign market share, currency manipulation, non-binding but closely followed administrative guidance from the government, keeping foreign products out of its home market. In other words, they won't allow American semiconductors into Japan, financed trading companies with global reach, and orchestrated fierce domestic competition. So Japan is deploying a full range of tools, not allowing foreign semiconductors into Japan, subsidizing their industries. They're going whole hog to dominate the semiconductor industry, and the U.S. firms are suffering losses. And so Reagan tries to negotiate a U.S.-Japan semiconductor agreement. And lo and behold, this agreement doesn't work because the Japanese made promises they had no intention of keeping. And I don't know why anybody was ever fooled by this. It happens again and again. These sort of international agreements where the other party, the foreign nation, promises the sky, promises all these things they're going to do, and then immediately attempts to find ways to circumvent the promises that they've made, or just outright fails to keep their promises. Now, in this case, luckily, the U.S. decided, well, if you're not going to hold up your end of this agreement, we're going to impose a tariff, a 100% tariff on $300 million of Japanese electronic goods. And that actually worked. When we stopped with these ridiculous agreements and started playing hardball by imposing the tariffs. The agreements are nonsense. People devoted to globalism are the type of people who think an agreement is the first thing that we should do. What we need to strive for are agreements. Agreements with foreign nations. Treaties and agreements. And, international cooperation to make sure that everything works well for everybody. No, you need to play hardball with these people. And so the 100% tariff on the Japanese electronic goods actually had a result. But in any event, the Defense Science Board released a report suggesting that an organization be founded, a consortium of semiconductor companies. And this organization is funded by DARPA, and the U.S. companies contributed an equal amount. 14 U.S. companies matched DARPA's contribution. DARPA was not allowed to lead this because they didn't want it aimed at military application. They wanted it to be aimed at the civilian industry, and that the military would benefit from the overall growth of the American semiconductor industry. So foreign companies are not allowed in. He says membership was limited to U.S.-owned firms. American subsidiaries of foreign companies were excluded. This is U.S. firms only. And the government's paying for half of it. $100 million a year. And it's wildly successful. They meet some of their goals. They're able to produce this 0.35 micron semiconductor, and they only use American equipment to produce it. Completely American made. And they found that it was very successful. And when the government stopped funding it, the organizations, the companies continued the consortium. But then, 2 years later, is 2 years after the government stopped giving grants, Sematech, this consortium, decided that what they wanted to do was bring in foreign firms from all over the world. Firms from South Korea, firms from Germany, firms from Taiwan. Every semiconductor manufacturer across the world is invited to join this consortium. And this just drives me crazy. The consortium was formed with the explicit intent of increasing U.S. industrial capability. Foreign companies were not allowed in. U.S. subsidiaries of foreign companies were not allowed in so long as the government was involved. And then the minute the government said, okay, my work here is done, the corporations threw open the doors to foreign companies to share the technology, to do joint research and development projects with these foreign companies. Ridiculous. And they said, whoa, we're global companies. Why wouldn't we have a global consortium? You're not global companies. That was the whole point. You're not global companies. You're American companies. And part of the problem is that the government, well, there's several problems. One of them is that to use the specific terminology, he says, the U.S. responded when its semiconductor industry was on the brink of collapse. So there's problem number one. The government doesn't want to get involved, doesn't want to build us an industrial policy, doesn't want to have a consortium, doesn't want to work with companies, doesn't want to pick winners and losers until the industry is on the verge of collapse. Does this sound familiar? Wall Street, automobile industry, bailouts. Once the industry is on the verge of collapse, then the U.S. government says, all right, the taxpayer wallet will open up now to bail you guys out because you're failing. Rather than being involved every step of the way to make sure that the semiconductor industry never reaches that point. Like the Japanese involvement in the semiconductor industry was not something that the Japanese implemented at the last possible minute. The Japanese had industrial policy every step of the way, and that is how they got to the point where they were at. That is how they destroyed the U.S. industry, was because they had industrial policy the whole way through, and they never just stopped and walked away. That's the other problem. After they achieve one of their goals, and that was a great goal to achieve, but after they achieved one of their goals, their primary goal to achieve this technology level, the government said, all right, my work here is done. We're not giving you any more money. So it was like, let's wait until the last possible minute to involve ourselves. And the minute the crisis has passed, we're leaving. That's the sort of industrial policy the U.S. has. Then, 2 years after, the corporations decide to throw the doors open because they don't view themselves as American companies. They're not interested in American industrial policy. They're not interested in the state of the nation. They're interested in their bottom lines, and they think that they want to work. And I don't even know. I have a hard time wrapping my head around what even the benefit of this is, of opening the door to these foreign companies. But they talk a little bit, he mentions briefly the Japanese kairetsu. These are like Japanese organization groups. They're groups of companies. They're sort of consortiums or whatever you want to call it. Groups of companies in Japan that work together. The banks, the manufacturers, they're sort of like a family of companies, and they get preferential treatment from the banks, and they all wash each other's backs. They're all benefiting each other and working together. They're not really as in competition. It's more like this kairetsu is in competition with that kairetsu. This family of companies is in competition with that family of companies, and the whole thing is overseen by the government. They're not going to let U.S. companies join the kairetsu because the Japanese aren't interested in globalism. They want to win. They want their companies to win. But the U.S. companies don't feel that way, and the U.S. government doesn't enforce its will on the companies and demand that they maintain loyalty to the United States and advance the interests of the United States first and foremost, like they should. So anyway, that was just a part that kind of got under my skin when I read that, and I thought I'd share it with you. That's all I want to cover from this book. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.